In this nugget, you and I get to take a look at the creative method that we're going to use to get an ESXi host configured as a virtual machine inside of a VMware Workstation environment. Let's begin. As we prepare to install an ESXi host as part of our vSphere infrastructure, I have a question for you, my friend, and that is this. Why is it that we are creating this entire environment inside of another hypervisor, in this case, VMware Workstation? I mean, in a real world, you and I would never do this in a production environment because having a hypervisor, which is then running another hypervisor, which is then running virtual machines on its own, is not the most efficient thing to do for a production network. In fact, it would be disastrous. And so my question for you is, why are we doing it here in this lab environment? And if you're saying, Keith, it's simple, it's so that you and I can lab this up on a single physical computer, one PC that is running VMware Workstation. And that way, you and I have a practice lab that we can use and practice with and build our skills with without having to touch a production network to do it. So I just wanted to give that one little reminder of why we're doing this inside of VMware Workstation, and it's just for convenience for our lab environment. So the next question that comes up is, okay, now that we have VMware Workstation set up, how do we go about installing our first ESXi host in this environment? And the answer is we need to get the software from VMware. And there's a couple of ways we could get there. You could just do a Google search for vSphere evaluation, and that would lead you there. And once you get to VMware's website, if you have an account, you can use that. Or if you want to set up a free account, you can use that as well. And then from their site, go to the evaluation section and request an evaluation of vSphere. Here's the evaluation that I requested. It was VMware vSphere with operations management. And then once I was signed up for that evaluation, there was a link for a download trial, and it took me to a download page where I could download all the components, including the ESXi host software, the vCenter server software, and many other components that VMware is making available as part of this evaluation. So what I've already done for this nugget is I've gone to the VMware website and I've downloaded all the software that we're going to need as part of vSphere to install it in our virtualized environment. And specifically for this nugget, we're going to take a look at installing an ESXi host using the .iso file that was included as part of the downloads for the vSphere evaluation from VMware. So here's my computer, here's our PC. It's got a few local drives attached to it. So the ISO file that we're going to use to install the ESXi host is currently sitting on the Y drive of this local PC that's running VMware Workstation. Now, when we deploy a new machine inside of VMware Workstation, there are going to be some defaults in place regarding that new virtual machine. And I'd like to draw your attention to the networking portion in our vSphere infrastructure that we're building. You'll notice that we have lots of different networks. We've got a management network, a storage network, a vMotion network, a couple of networks for the virtual machines that will be running as guest operating systems on the ESXi hosts. And our ESXi hosts are going to need connectivity to all of those networks. So as part of our configuration of these ESXi hosts as we build them inside of VMware Workstation, we are definitely going to want to give each of those hosts additional network adapters above and beyond the one network adapter that they're given by default. And have no fear, I'll walk you through the entire process. So from a VMware Workstation perspective, each of these ESXi hosts that we're going to be creating, we're going to give them 10 network interfaces. So we're going to add 9 more interfaces. So 9 more plus the one that VMware Workstation gave it by default will give us a total of 10 network interface cards for each of our ESXi hosts that we're building inside of VMware Workstation. It's also going to be important to put those network interface cards into the correct VLANs. Now, inside of VMware Workstation, we have created multiple networks, and we did that in our previous nugget, using the virtual network editor inside VMware Workstation. So as part of our virtual machine definition for ESXi1 and ESXi2, we're going to want to make sure that we map the correct interfaces on the ESXi host to the correct VLAN. And to do that, we're going to put interface 1 and 2 onto the management VLAN, this blue network right here. We're going to put interfaces 3 and 4 on the storage network that's here in orange. We're going to map interfaces 5 and 6 on the ESXi host to the vMotion network, that's this green one right here. And then interfaces 7 and 8 we're going to map to VMnet 3, which is one of our networks that we're going to be using for our guest operating systems and guest VMs that are running on the ESXi hosts. And then interfaces 9 and 10 we're going to map to the second network, the 10.4.4 network, which we are also going to make available to be used by the virtual machines that are running on the ESXi hosts. So the question may come up, okay, Keith, I understand in our virtualized environment we want to put the right interfaces of the ESXi hosts into the correct VLANs. What is the practical application of this in a production network? Well, in a production network, if we had physical ESXi hosts, we would want to take their interfaces and physically plug them in or connect them into switch ports which were assigned to specific VLANs. So in a physical environment, interface 1 and 2 on ESXi1 would be plugged into, for example, VLAN 10. And interface 3 and 4 would be plugged into VLAN 20. And 5 and 6 into VLAN 30 and so forth. And each of those VLANs have their own associated IP addressing scheme associated with them. So here inside of VMware Workstation, running on the computer that's going to be providing this wonderful entire environment for us to build our vSphere lab, we are going to create our first ESXi host as a virtual machine inside this environment. And to do that, we're going to click on File. From the drop-down, we'll select New Virtual Machine. I'm going to choose the option that says Typical and click on Next. So regarding the question, how are we going to install our operating system? In this case, it's going to be ESXi. We're going to choose the radio button that says Installer Disk Image because I have that ISO image on my computer. I downloaded it from vSphere as part of the evaluation. We'll click on Browse. And we'll simply browse to the location where that file exists. So here we have the VMware-vmvisor-installer, and we'll double click on it or click on Open to use that image. Then we'll click on Next. I'm going to call this guy ESXi1. I'm also going to specify the location on the host computer that's running the VMware Workstation where we want to keep the files, including the hard disk files that are going to be used to support this virtual machine. So the virtual machine name, the location for the files, they look good to me. We'll click on Next. Now it's asking, how big of a hard drive do you want this virtual machine to believe that it has? And I'm going to tell it that I want this virtual machine to believe that it has 100 gigabytes of disk space. And you might ask the question, well, Keith, if we give this virtual machine, this ESXi host, 100 gigabytes, won't we be tying up all that space? And the answer is, by default, no. By default, it does something called thin provisioning, which means that the virtual machine believes it can have up to 100 gigs. However, in measurable terms, if this virtual machine is only using, for example, 20 gigs or 22 gigs, that's all that will really be tied up on the physical disk at that moment. I'm also going to accept the default that says please split the virtual disk into multiple files as needed and click on Next. Now from here we have a couple options. We could click on Finish, or we could click on Customize Hardware and add the network adapters. It really doesn't matter if we add the network adapters here or if we want to click on Finish and then modify the properties of this virtual machine, we could do that as well. So regarding ESXi1, here's the memory, processors, hard disk, the network adapters, and so forth that this virtual machine believes it's going to have available to it. Now, if we don't want those specifics, which we don't, we would go ahead and select ESXi1. We would right click and then simply click on settings. That is one of the ways of changing the settings for this virtual machine. So if we want to raise the memory, for example, if we want to give it more than 4 gigs, we can simply go ahead and change it. We could use this sliding bar up and down to change the amount, or we could go ahead and simply type in the amount of memory we want this virtual machine to have. Now you'll notice over here on the left in the summary, that isn't reflected. The 8,000 isn't reflected until we actually click here, and now it's reflected. Regarding the number of processors, you can specify that you have more or less processors. Now you can't go above and beyond what your existing physical host has to offer. So currently my host is running an i7 chip. It has multiple cores, and as a result, I can tell my VMware workstation to give this virtual machine multiple cores. So whether I say it's 2 processors, 1 core each, or if I said it was 1 processor, 2 cores each, either one of those options would work based on the hardware that I'm currently using. I've also got the virtualization technology, which is going to be enabled for this virtual machine, which again is important to have available and enabled in your BIOS if you want the nested virtualization to work, because this ESXi host that we're going to create inside of VMware Workstation is also going to have its own VMs running on it. And to make that work, the virtualization technology has to be present and available in the BIOS of your computer. Regarding the network adapter, what we are definitely going to want to change here is we are going to want to change the number of network adapters and where they're connected. So the first thing we could do is let's add 9 additional network adapters. And to do that, we'll click on Add. I've got user account control saying, hey, do you want to let this application make changes to this computer? I'm going to say, you betcha. And then from the list, we're going to go ahead and select network adapter and click on Next and click on Finish. Now, we could also assign them as we bring them in, but I would just recommend do this 9 times so that we have a total of 10 network adapters, and then go back through and specifically assign each of those network adapters to the correct VLAN or correct VMnet on VMware Workstation. So I'm going to repeat this 8 more times to get a total of 10 network adapters. So now it may not be really obvious that I've got 10 network adapters, but let me go ahead and do this. I'm going to go ahead and click on OK, and then we'll go back to the settings of ESXi1, and then it can sort for us. So under network adapters, this is network adapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then because of how the screen is being represented here, the 10 is being chopped off, but that is adapter 10. So I've got 10 network interface cards that this virtual machine called ESXi1, the host that we're going to be using as part of vSphere, believes it has available to it. Now our next task is to go ahead and associate these with the correct VLAN. Or in our case, because we're running VMware Workstation, with the right VMnet that VMware Workstation is providing. So here's what we're going to do. Adapter 1 and 2, we are going to associate with VMnet 0, which is bridged to my physical network here in my home office. That's the 192.168.1 network. Interfaces 3 and 4, we are going to go ahead and associate with VMnet 1, which we are going to be using for network-based storage. Interfaces 5 and 6, we are going to associate with VMnet 2, which is going to be used for the really cool feature called vMotion, where we can move dynamically a virtual machine from one ESXi host over to another without the customer even noticing. Interfaces 7 and 8 on the virtual machine, we are going to associate with VMnet 3, which is going to be one of the networks that we can associate with the VMs that are running in our vSphere environment. And adapters 9 and 10 on the ESXi host, we're going to associate with VMnet 4, which is yet another network, the 10.44 network, that we can also use for our VMs that are being hosted by ESXi1 or ESXi2. So to make this association, it's really simple. What we're going to do is we're going to click on each of the adapters and then simply say what we want to do. So on adapter 1, I'm going to go ahead and say that I want to bridge it directly to the physical network. Now what I also could do is we could also say associate with VMnet 0, and VMnet 0 is actually bridged out to the outside network. Either one of those options would work. I'm going to go ahead and say VMnet 0. And then we'll go over to interface 2. That's also going to be associated with VMnet 0. Then we'll go to 3, and we'll make sure that's associated with VMnet 1. And we'll go to 4. That also goes to 1. And we're going to repeat that same exact process until each of the network interface cards that are associated with our ESXi host are in the correct VM network. So this ESXi host, when it boots up, it's going to believe it has 10 network interface cards, and each of those 10 network interface cards are associated with the specific VM nets, which are equivalent to VLANs, that are being provided by our VMware workstation environment. So if that all looks good, which I think it does, we'll click on OK. Now my question for you is this. How do you think we would go about creating our second ESXi host? And if you're saying, Keith, I think I got this one, it would be like identical to how we created the first one. We would create a new virtual machine inside VMware Workstation. We would give it the 10 network interfaces. We would associate those with the correct VLANs or the correct VM nets provided by VMware Workstation. And the big difference is we'd have a different location in the file system for keeping the files for ESXi2. And the name of our second virtual machine would be different. The second machine would be ESXi-2 instead of ESXi-1. In this nugget, we've taken a look at the next steps of getting ESXi installed as part of our vSphere environment, which includes downloading the vSphere eval from VMware, creating a brand new virtual machine, the ESXi host, that's going to be inside of our VMware environment. And then, regarding that virtual machine that's going to be our ESXi host, we added 9 additional network adapters. I also modified the amount of memory that's going to be allocated for that virtual machine. And in our case, I gave it 8 gigabytes of RAM. So in your environment, if you're on a computer that has, for example, 16 gigabytes of RAM, and you tell ESXi1 that it can have 8, and you tell ESXi2 that it can have 8, there might be some warning messages that pop up as you try to do that because the operating system in VMware Workstation says, oh, wait, I don't have enough physical RAM to meet those requests. And if you do run into something like that, there's a couple of options. Number one, you could go ahead and tell each of these ESXi devices, these VMs, that perhaps maybe they have 6 gigabytes each or even 4 gigabytes each. And that could work as well. So you may want to adjust the amount of RAM that you're associating and allocating to each of these VMs based on the amount of memory that your host computer has. It is quiz time, my friend, and the quiz is related to the lab that we are building as part of these nuggets. Question number 1, how many total network adapters should each ESXi virtual machine that we're creating in VMware Workstation, how many adapters should each of them have? And the answer is, my friend, 10. Good job. And it's also not just a matter of having 10 network interface cards, it's also a matter of making sure that we have mapped those network interface cards to the correct VLANs or the correct VM nets inside of our VMware Workstation environment. Question number 2, what VM nets are associated with adapters 3 and 4? So if this is ESXi1 and it's got its 10 network adapters, regarding adapters 3 and 4, what VLAN, what VM net should those 2 network adapters be associated with? And based on our table that was in this nugget, the VM net that those 2 should be associated with are VM net 1. And we're going to be using that network later in this course for the benefit of network-based storage. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to get ESXi1 and ESXi2 both installed as virtual machines as part of VMware Workstation. And then, in our next nugget, we'll take a look at doing the bootstrap configuration of an ESXi host and getting it up and running on the network. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.